Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. And today we're going to talk about sociopathic SF. What do I mean by sociopathic science fiction? I mean the science fiction which deals with criminals, with people who are outsiders in our society because they cannot conform to the code of conduct, the consensus that we all cleave to in our day-to-day lives. And science fiction is an interesting thing in that respect, in that it deals with the transgressive and the new. So naturally, crime falls into many SF narratives. In a way, this is a video in which you'll do the work, because I want to get you to start thinking about how crime infects science fiction narratives and how the nature of crime is defined by society itself. But specifically, I want to talk about some classic SF, some fairly classic SF, which looks at the nature of sociopaths, criminals, and how society deals with them, and whether it deals with them too harshly, not harshly enough. And of course, it makes us ask questions about how we deal with them as a whole. You can take many examples from classic SF. For example, Neuromancer by William Gibson is absolutely full of crimes, and the key crime in that, of course, is liberating AIs so they can connect with each other and form their own network, something which is prevented by electronic shotguns wired to their foreheads, in case the protagonist in Neuromancer is a criminal in that he steals data, he sells it through fences to other people, but he commits the ultimate crime in this, albeit unknowingly to a degree. Then there's things like the Stainless Steel Rat series by Harry Harrison, which is a very light series about an international criminal called Slippery Jim DeGriz. And I read these when I was a teenager. I read a couple of them. They never really resonated with me, and I didn't find they were my sort of thing, but you may like them. And then, of course, you get the sort of pulpy sort of crossover tropes. If you take, for example, The Shining Girls by Lauren Bucas, Bucas, I should say, is the correct way to pronounce her name, as she told me that herself. You've got the time-traveling serial killer type thing. And, those things is where SF meshes with sort of popular fiction. However, we can go a lot more deeply than that. So let's look at a few examples. I mean, in the contemporary world, the way to begin thinking about criminals and prison and punishment is in Michel Foucault's classic non-fiction book from 1975, Discipline and Punish. And it's well worth reading because Foucault was a philosopher focused on power, and he talked in harrowing detail about the extreme torture execution of a would-be regicide called Robert Francis Deviance in the mid-18th century. And you read this 3 or 4 page account of this torture execution, and it's really quite something. And that kind of infected the discourse around the birth of the prison and how we deal with people. And recently I've been rereading The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, and this of course is The Shadow of the Torturer, here in its UK first edition. And this is set 1 million years in the future, where there's a society in a dying earth realm, where there is a guild of torturers, and Severian, the central character, is raised as a torturer and executioner. And that itself makes you think about the nature of the society he's in. Very often in SF, it is the societies themselves that seem to be more criminal from our perspective than the criminals. This, of course, is something that's been tackled a lot in 20th century literature. 1984, for example, in the future world of 1984, there are no laws. However, there are the thought police, and people are arrested all the time for not conforming to the societal norms. And of course, we see that in things like Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. But what we don't see very much of is the actual treatment of people who we would regard as criminals in our way of looking at things. And a classic example of that is, of course, Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange. And A Clockwork Orange looks at a teenage villain in the near future. He's 14-year-old and he commits acts of violence constantly. He's always off his face on drugs. It's rape, murder, shoplifting, all sorts of things. And we see how Alex is subjected to the Ludovico technique, a chemical conditioning which involves an unspecified drug and the repetition of films, until he is conditioned in a Pavlovian sense into being unable to commit acts of violence unless he becomes nauseated. But he loses his choice. And this is the question: is it better for rebels to be free to be lured into a false consensus with society. This is a later hardcover reprint. Burgess signed this to me way back in the early 90s, just before he died. He was a great guy. It's an amazing novel. I've read this dozens of times. But these are quite famous books. I want to talk about things which are less famous, less well known. And it's worth saying that some of the best things which come up in SF about crime and punishment and criminals are in short forms, and we'll come to those later on. Despite the affinities between science fiction and crime fiction, they're often quite different. I mean, crime fiction obviously is based on problem solving and on thrills and the combination of the two things together. And you would think that this would make very well for crime writers to cross over into SF, but they very rarely did. I can only think of one writer who produced an equal amount of SF as he did crime, and that was Frederick Brown. And Frederick Brown's SF tended towards the satirical short forms, very funny things. But his crime was very black and noir. And if you can ever get hold of a book like His Name Was Death, I'd urge you to do so. But here's an example of somebody who was a very prolific crime writer, who wrote over 100 books. He used at least 6 different pseudonyms. This is Donald E. Westlake, and this is his collection, Tomorrow's Crimes. Westlake was also known as Richard Stark, Tucker Coe, Edwin West, Kurt Clark, and Kurt Clark was the name he used for his science fiction. And when he started writing science fiction in the 60s, he only produced one novella and a number of short stories, and they're all in this book from Mysterious Press, a crime imprint, if you can find it. And he had a sort of dual personality, rather like Jekyll and Hyde. He would write very hard-boiled things featuring a thief called Parker, and they were published under the name Richard Stark. And he would write very sort of upbeat, funny things about another thief called Dortmunder, and they were probably more popular, but the ones which have lasted are the Parker novels, is more hard-boiled things. And in a way, this novel, this is Anna Chaos, published by Seven House. This is quite rare now. This posits a society where everybody is a criminal. It's a prison planet. And this is probably one of the more common tropes in sociopathic SF, what we do with criminals. And it's about a guy who's sent to a prison planet. And there is a classic sort of trope there. There's no laws there at all. And you have to protect yourself as best you can. And the central character, this Malone, he believes that his brother had died on this planet, and he is going there with a small cache of weapons as a criminal himself to face the entire planet, find who killed his brother and take him down. And this is a classic crime trope. Didn't you kill my brother? It's very common in British crime, that cliche, especially in the cinema, and it's handled really beautifully in Ted Lewis's novel Get Carter, aka Jack's Return Home. So this is a rare example, and if you can get hold of either of these, Anna Chaos is actually inside this volume, and it was first published as a little ace A format book, and it is really good fun. But you can see when you read this, the Westlake's heart wasn't really in SF, it was in crime fiction, but it's still well worth picking up to see. If you ever see either of those books, pick them up anyway, because they are pretty rare. But there was already a tradition in the 1950s, and the 1950s is really the time when the sociopath came on board in SF as opposed to the cartoon villain, because increasingly people were questioning society. After World War II, there were huge changes both in Britain and America, socially and politically. There was the Cold War, there was the retreat in Britain from more conservative politics to more left-wing ones, and people were beginning to think a lot more about society and how the deviant would be handled. And some of the best examples of this are, quite frankly, in short stories, and one of the very finest short story collections you'll ever get is the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 1. And this is all short stories published between 1929 and 1964, chosen by the science fiction writers of America when they founded the Nebula Award. And there's a number of absolutely classic things in this. Just glancing through it, I mean, this is a fantastic anthology either way. And there are things which are on the edge, rather like Born of Man and Woman by Richard Matheson. But really, the ones which come up here in a big way are the stories The Country of the Kind by Damon Knight and It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby. Now, The Country of the Kind, I would say, I can't say I've probably read maybe half of Knight's output, maybe not even that. And I'm not a massive fan. I find him incredibly inconsistent. This is one of his short story collections. He wrote a lot of short stories, and this is Rule Golden. And what you're seeing on the cover there is pretty much in that title. It's in that title story. So, you know, if you fancy something really poppy, you can pick it up. And he did some really poppy things. He did some thoughtful things as well. And The Country of the Kind is a wonderful narrative. It's a first person narrative in which this unnamed narrator stumbles into a town. And when I say that, it reminds me of the lyric of China Girl by Iggy Pop, which David Bowie did a cover version of. I stumble into town just like a sacred cow, visions of swastikas in my head, plans for everyone, a sort of messianic type of thing. And of course, criminals are messianic types very often. They feel that they're outside of society, they're better than society, and they can do what they want, largely because they've been rejected by society. And in The Country of the Kind, which is actually not in here, I don't have it in a night collection, I only have it in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, the protagonist stumbles into this town and he begins committing acts of vandalism. And it's a sort of fairly perfect, small, semi-rural town, and he does all sorts of things, and they seem quite childish and petty. He wrecks things, he tips things over, he smashes things, breaks into people's houses, and people just, they don't fight him, they don't catch him, they don't call the police, they just walk away. And what you get is this wonderful idea where the way that criminals, who are super rare in this future society, are treated, and they are treated by being ostracized. Now, that is a spoiler as such, but it won't interfere with your enjoyment of the story because it is so absolutely wonderful. And the writing is beautiful and clear and very evocative. You can see everything in it. So The Country of the Kind is a really, really special one, and it had a massive influence on SF that came after it, and also there were some before it which kind of prefigured it. I would say that one of the things that prefigures The Country of the Kind is a wonderful story by C.L. Moore called Vintage Season. And this is Vintage Season by C.L. Moore with a sequel written decades later by Robert Silverberg called In Another Country. And this is a tour double. And Vintage Season appeared in the 1940s, and it's one of Moore's most famous stories. And in Vintage Season, a guy is renting out a house. He's renting out his house. He's short of money. And a number of people have moved in to the house, and they're renting it. They have very strange names, and they dress very strangely, and they speak strangely. And eventually he realizes that they are from the future. And of course, the norms of the future, you know, the past is a foreign country. We do things differently there, and we do things differently in the future. So it questions how the behavior of the future might be different to the behavior of the present. Also, these time travelers are slumming it. They have come back in time to this American town in the 1940s as if they're waiting for something, as if they're watching for something, and something does occur, and it's devastating. And it's written with Moore's usual sensual skill, and the way he depicts one of the women particularly and how the man becomes entranced by her is classic Moore, the sort of thing she was doing in the 1930s with the Northwest Smith stories. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. It's a devastating ending, and it really will make you sort of sit up and exhale your breath and think, wow, it's really something. Vintage Season. The sequel by Silverberg is not as good, but it's well worth reading. The Vintage Season is very widely anthologized. It's in all sorts of things, and it's also one of the classic time travel stories. And it does make you question about what is crime now, what will be crime then, and what was crime when, as it were. Going back to the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, another classic story in here I mentioned is the story It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby. Now, Jerome Bixby gets mentioned now and again as the, I think he was the screenwriter, he was certainly the author of the short story which inspired a film called It, The Terror from Beyond Space, which is a classic guy in a rubber monster suit gets on board a spaceship thing. And people seem to think that It, The Terror from Beyond Space, which was filmed in the 50s, is the origin of Alien. It's not, of course. The origin of Alien is two stories from A. Van Vogt's Voyage of the Space Beagle, Black Destroyer and Discord and Scarlet. But the Jerome Bixby story in here, It's a Good Life, and the emphasis is on good, which is in italics, is a fascinating short story of the kind that Ray Bradbury would write, but it has a kind of more chilling edge. And it's set in a small village, and there's a young boy, and everybody seems very, very, very keen to suck up to this kid, to sort of tell him that he's a good boy and that life is good, because there is a terrible secret. This boy has an ability which has changed reality, and he is, in essence, the ultimate sociopath. And it speaks to the worries that people had post-war as adolescents finally had spending power, and they started going absolutely wild about what we should do with the young juvenile delinquent. And It's a Good Life is a fantastic story. As I say, pick this up in any form you can. It's a wonderful book at any level, and it's essential for every single SF collection there is. Without it, you don't have a lot of context for American SF in that whole period of 1930 to the early 60s. Of course, in the 1950s, many of the great names of social SF came up and began writing their best work. Some of them had already been active before that, notably Alfred Bester, and this is The Demolished Man, his first novel, which won the first ever Hugo Award in 1953. And Bester had been writing for the pulp since the late 30s. And The Demolished Man, I mean, often gets knocked over in the rush. People want to read Bester, but they want to read The Stars My Destination, the book which in the UK we always called Tiger. And The Demolished Man is the narrative of one Ben Reich, a capitalist entrepreneur in the future who runs a very successful company, and he's only really got one competitor who he just wants to kill, and it's the only way he can get peace, because he can't sleep. When he does sleep, he has these recurring nightmares of a burning man. But there is a problem, for despite Reich's money and fame and his ability to manipulate people, the police will be on his back, because in the future society of The Demolished Man, the police are ESPers, so often crimes are stopped before they're committed. And he comes up with a novel way of managing to block the peepers, as he calls them, those telepathic police, from looking into his head so he can commit the murder of his rival. But he knows that if he fails, he faces the ultimate penalty, demolition. When I read this, I just burned through it, and I made assumptions about what demolition was, and it's not what you think. And that really, really got to me. It's a classic conceptual breakthrough ending when your expectations are upturned. In some ways, I think it's a better book than Tiger. It's shorter, it's sharper, it's harder and faster. And I think there's one part for me of Tiger which sags, which is the bit when Gullyfall is back on the prison on Earth. And of course, Gullyfall is an even bigger sociopath than Ben Reich, and he becomes the apotheotic figure. He is somebody who rises up and shows the way forward, which Ben Reich doesn't really doing this. So it shows the cultural changes as people were thinking more and more about rebellion in the 50s. And it's a cracking read. It's like firecrackers going off everywhere, sparks shooting through your brain, style, content, structure, muscularity, it's all there. This still puts a lot of things from this period in the shade, and even a lot of things being written now are way behind this still, certainly in terms of stylistics and dynamics. A writer who came up as a young man in the 50s, whose work I really revere, is the very wonderful Robert Silverberg. And Silverberg wrote a fair amount about crime and punishment, and this is Hawksbill Station, which inspired the thumbnail for this video, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment. But just as an aside, earlier on when I talked about vintage season and about The Country of the Kind, there is a story by Silverberg which is called, let's think, To See the Invisible Man, which is about how, again, a future criminal is treated, and a particular treatment he's given, which sets him aside from society. To See the Invisible Man. It's one of Silverberg's own favourite stories. It's anthologized a lot. It comes up in different collections. Well worth looking for. Hawksbill Station was initially a short story in Galaxy magazine in 1967, and this is the time when Silverberg was returning to SF in a big way after virtually abandoning it for many years. And when he came back to SF, he put aside the sort of more pulpy works that he did earlier on, and he concentrated on themes like power and transcendence. This is probably the last of his more workmanlike books before he gets into his key period in which he really flowers, but it's nonetheless excellent. Hawksbill Station was first published in the UK as The Anvil of Time, and that refers to a time travel device called the Anvil. And this is a sort of fairly typical prison planet thing, except the prison planet is Earth. And that works really well because the society depicted in this, which we never see because all the action is on the prison planet, is a dystopian one where political prisoners are sent back in time to the late Cambrian period before there's any life on Earth. All the life is in the ocean, so it's extremely barren. And there are something like 150 men living on this rock island, and the only thing they've got to eat is the arthropods that they can fish out of the sea, which just sounds vile, eating trilobites and stuff. and they're led by a guy called Barrett, who's injured, but he's kind of the toughest guy there. And a new prisoner comes through the anvil and appears. And the men there want to know what news there is from their future society, from the dystopian they're doing. Is there any sign of rebellion? Is anything happening? And you get all the power dynamics that you get in a classic prison narrative. And this guy sort of clams up and he doesn't want to say anything. And what he says is sort of rather opaque. And they're thinking, is this guy actually a plant of some kind? You know, is something going on? Is he somebody who's going to lead us out of this? Is he somebody who's been sent back to spy on us to see if somehow we're going to make our way back to the present, which is kind of impossible unless they can get control of the anvil. And as you see, it's very short, but it's a great little book. I've read it a few times, and in terms of entertainment, brief but strong characterization, and a wonderful evocation of this grey, featureless seascape, you know, and there's nothing living. It's absolutely wonderful. I really recommend it. It's a good entry-level, low-level Silverberg. You should read them maybe before you go into the more classic works. It's fantastic stuff. Hawksbill Station, also known as the Anvil of Time. Silverberg, of course, as I say, he wrote an awful lot, and something that he did which was similar in some ways to A Clockwork Orange, and similar also to The Demolished Man in some ways, is The Second Trip. The Second Trip was published in the early 70s. This is the Penal Orange edition, and somewhere here I've got a Gollancz UK Yellow Jacket first. There you go. I love these. I know a lot of you find them boring, but I absolutely love them, the different typography. And The Second Trip is set in our century. Of course, this was written like 60 years ago. And habitual criminals have their brains wiped, their memories wiped, and a new personality is built up from the same body. But something sort of goes wrong with this, and something is triggered in the central character. And this is one of Silverberg's most uncomfortable and uncompromising books. It really did make me flinch. And in that way, it has the kind of bitterness which people ascribe to his novel Thorns, which is seen as the beginning of his key phase. I personally think the beginning of his key phase is The Man in the Maze. If you're interested in The Man in the Maze, there is a video about that on the channel called Labyrinth of the Vile, and there's lots of Silverberg on this channel. So The Second Trip is one which really makes you go, the sharp intake of breath, and I really enjoyed it. It's very powerful. On my first reading, I wasn't convinced. On my second reading, when I found it a more smooth experience, because I don't think I was expecting how astringent and vinegary this was, I really got into it. That's The Second Trip. Speaking of astringent and vinegary, you know, the way that people are treated in prison is a really important issue. And of course, prison is there to protect the public. And that's something that politicians seem to forget. We talk about discipline, punishment, but most of all, prison is about protecting us. When people are in prison, they really should be treated humanely, because it is a terrible punishment. And we can't afford to keep them in prison for life. We have to let them back into society. So what do we do? Unfortunately, some societies will not allow that. And when societies won't allow that, and they won't allow rehabilitation, and they don't give sufficient protection to the public by keeping people in prison long enough to be rehabilitated, not that I'm an expert in any of this, you do have social problems. And I mean, the classic dystopian SF novel of the 60s, in which intellectuals become a real problem for future governments, and you can kind of imagine this with some of the regimes we've got on Earth today, is Camp Concentration by Thomas M. Dish, in which an intellectual or writer is imprisoned for being anti-war, and he is subjected to a treatment which raises his intelligence. So it's rather similar to Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, but it has implications. These treatments have other implications which are terrifying, staggering and horrible. And of course, it's written with Dish's trademark wit, mordancy and satire. An absolutely wonderful book. And I know lots of people who are not SF readers who absolutely love this book. Really, really great one to read if you like literary SF. Dish, of course, was one of the masters of that kind of writing. Somebody else who, until comparatively recently, I mentioned him a few times, then I think Matt at Bookpill really got into him, is D.G. Compton. And this is Farewell Earth's Bliss, from the late 60s, and this is the Hodder and Stoughton UK first edition. And this is a very harrowing tale of life on a prison planet is full of racism, torture, foul language, and also it is quite a terrible depiction of a prison planet, but it's also a very compassionate one and a very well written one. So if you're looking for a prison planet narrative that has literary virtue, I would really recommend you try and find Farewell Earth's Bliss. There are copies out there in paperback. Really great neglected writer Compton. There is a career overview of all his work on my channel. Of course, it's not all grim, though it is mostly grim. SF excels at satire, and one of its finest satirists was always our very own Candide, Robert Sheckley, and this is The State of Civilization. This is a very early Sheckley novel, and is similar to Donald Westlake's Anna Chaos in that it depicts a planet where everybody is a criminal and they have their own society, and it's about how a guy makes his way through that society. And Sheckley wasn't always comfortable as a novelist. His novels are very episodic and they go from one thing to another, but they are very amusing, and this was his take on it. And of course Sheckley did a classic thing in his story, The Seventh Victim, later filmed as The 10th Victim, which is about a society which is dominated by a kill game, where people are kept under control and passive because they have this atavistic need for violence. And this manifests itself in a game in which people can be hunters of victims. And once you agree to participate, you begin as a hunter, then you become a victim, and you have to kill your quarry within a certain amount of time, then they hunt you. When you get to a certain point, when you've made 7 kills, there's 10 kills in the film, and the book was later expanded into a tie-in edition, which Sheckley took a lot from the film, actually, and funny enough, it is one of his better novels. It's less episodic. Your status then increases, and you see the beginnings of that and the other sequels to the Hunter Victim series in The State of Civilization, where it is about raising your status through what you do, but you come in the essence of criminality, and it's great fun. People have mixed feelings about this one. I like it a lot. Some people think it's weaker, but as I say, Sheckley's novels do tend to the episodic and the unconventional. I want to finish here with a short story which I have mentioned before, and I mentioned it in my conceptual breakthrough stories in the Elements of SF series, and that's a story called The Pure Product. And The Pure Product is in this collection, Meeting in Infinity from Arkham House. It's also in a collection called The Pure Product, which was never published in the UK, so I don't have a copy. And The Pure Product, to my way of thinking, was the inspiration, or arguably the inspiration, for the film Natural Born Killers. Not a film I'm that fond of, but it does seem to prefigure it in some ways. And it begins with a narrative of a guy who is, again, drifting through America, and you'll see a theme coming out in several of these stories, and he is sort of driving from town to town, staying in motels, and he's committing random acts of callousness, and very often they're only crimes in essence, in the way that he thinks Wilder would, in his coldness, in his indifference, in his uncaring attitude towards it. And then he comes across a young woman who's hitchhiking, picks her up, and they drive off in the car. And they do all kinds of things. And where have they come from? How are they the way they are? What are they doing? And there is a link back to an earlier story I've mentioned here. I'm not going to mention which one, but this is one of the sort of great stories. And Kessel's an underrated writer. He's an English professor. I can't think of which university in the States he taught at. I have engaged with him once about how great I thought The Pure Product was, and that was online. And he wrote some great stories. A really funny novel called Good News from Outer Space was his first novel. He collabed a lot with a guy called James Patrick Kelly. I'm not so keen on his collaborations, but The Pure Product is one of the coldest, harshest, hardest science fiction stories I've read. And I don't mean hard SF in terms of technology. There's no technology in it, but it is SF, and it really lingers in the mind. And it's one of my favorite science fiction works published in the last 35 years, because it does bring the notion of what is sociopathy to mind and how it's defined by the society we live in. So there's a few ideas for you on sociopathic SF. I'm sure you've read loads of SF yourself which has crime in it, and there are lots of things about future police and supervillains and what have you, but I am talking about the kind of thing where there are people who are just simply too dangerous to be allowed amongst them. Maybe science fiction readers are amongst those people, who can say? Are science fiction readers and writers the literary sociopaths? I'd like to think so, because we question things. We want to see the norms upturned. We want to look at how society could evolve, and maybe the ways it should evolve, and maybe some of the ways that it shouldn't evolve. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Signing out for now. Bye.
you.